all of you for being on the next version of our summer series. We're going to continue to have just great timing and relevant information coming your way. Tomorrow we're doing a session with our purchasing folks on how they're handling all of the back to school efforts that they have. We're also going to be doing a use of federal funds webinar that's coming up in a few weeks, along with a special ed. And so there's just a lot to look forward to in the summer series. And again, we see hundreds of names that have been with us over the past few weeks and months, I guess. And we thank you for continuing to be interested in these high relevance topics. I'm Tasha Davenport, Deputy Executive and Chief Operations Officer. I've welcomed you. I want to let you know that we are recording the session, so you'll receive that back out with the list of resources that after the call. It typically takes about 24 hours for us to get that posted. There is the question and answer box that you can start to populate questions in, and then Sarah will be facilitating the Q&A with Edgar here in a bit towards the end of the session. So I don't think there's anything else that I can add. We want to get right to it. I want to turn over to Molly McGee-Hewitt, our Executive Director and Chief Operations Officer here at CASBO.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. It's great to see so many of you taking your time to do this. By the way, our podcast hit a new all-time high today with 10,000 listeners have heard our podcast. And so we're excited because between our podcast, this wonderful summer series, our news breaks, and all of the communication we have going out at CASBO, we're really trying to meet our members' needs by having up-to-date information. I mentioned to our presenters a few moments ago that I probably have had more emails regarding the state budget and the future of education in the last 24 hours than I have in months and months. I think that there are so many areas of concern, so many areas of maybe questioning that people still have, that today's summer series could not be more appropriate and more timely for us. So joining us today, we have our own Sarah Chez, who you've all come to know through CASBO as our head lobbyist, our head advocate. And we also have joining with us Edgar Cabral, who's the Deputy Legislative Analyst for K-12 Education in the Ledge Analyst Office. He holds a master's in public policy from UC Berkeley and a bachelor's in sociology from the University of California, Irvine, my old hometown down south. And also handles
excuse me, Molly, one moment. Christine, can you mute, please? Thank you.
Thank you. And who also handles education, finance, policy, and facilities. So he's our guy. So it's great to see him again. Great to have him join us. So welcome, Edgar Cabral. And I will turn it over to Sarah and Edgar.
Well, thank you so much, Edgar, for making yourself available. I'll get it right started and I'll go into your slide and just let you take it off. And as I see certain Q&As, we'll open it up because I think this really is an opportunity for our members to hear as much as information that we could provide them, given that we all received the trailer bill yesterday in the 2 days ago, really late in the evening. And so we've all been trying to digest it. So we appreciate your perspective in trying to break this down for us. So I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Molly, for the introduction. I think I will say I'll start by apologizing for my one slide presentation. I am absorbing much of this budget, just as you all are. And so I think I didn't flesh out the detail as much, but I'll talk through as much of it and provide a little bit more context for some of this to help walk you through the difference between what's in this budget and perhaps what was in the May revision. I'm going to cover kind of some of the major components. There are lots of other things. I'm happy to answer questions on other things that might come up. I will do my best to answer as many as I can, but there are, this has been an unprecedented budget. I mean, not only for many reasons, and I think because of that, I think some of this has happened a little quicker than I think happened in previous times. And so I'll do my best to answer questions that you might have. The budget, as you know, has not, the trailer bill has not been enacted yet. The Senate Budget Committee is actually going to hear it at some point this afternoon, I believe. And so this is all fairly fresh. But I did want to start by just kind of walking, for those of you who have been following what's going on with the budget and know what's in the May revision, just to give you a quick high level of what was in the May revision to provide you with some context so you can compare that with what's in this budget. So in the May revision, big change compared to what was in January. In January, we were provided those cost of living adjustments plus additional one-time spending for Prop 98, in Prop 98. Since then, obviously, we hit a recession. Revenues are projected to decrease significantly. So the May revision proposed a 10% reduction to the LCFF, also included about a 50% cut to the career technical education programs, $100 million reduction to after-school programs. Those were the kind of the big reductions in the K-12 pot. In addition, there were about $6 billion in payment deferrals that were also done in order to bring spending down down to the minimum guarantee. And the way that the administration had implemented those cuts and said, if there's additional federal funding, then these reductions would not be made. So if we do get, I think the target is $14 billion in additional federal funding beyond what's already been provided, that these cuts would not be made. This budget that now will be enacted soon, this 2021 Budget Act, essentially undoes all of those cuts and instead says this is essentially a flat budget. So there's not an LCFF COLA, but you'll be getting you aren't getting that 10% reduction. You'll be getting the same rates as you had last year. And then categorical programs also would not receive a COLA, but you would not see any major cuts. So no cuts to CTE programs or to after school. Now, the overall spending in this budget is pretty much the same as in the May revise. So how do you get there? The way that you do is by having much larger payment deferrals for schools. So under this budget, you would have up to a total of $11 billion in K-12 payment deferrals. And the only thing changing if the state were to receive additional federal funding is that those deferrals would be reduced. That's sort of the change. Your program is sort of a flat budget with potentially lots of late payments. There's another. So I think there are a couple other big funding sources for schools in the May revision that remain in place that I want to highlight. One, I realized I forgot to include it on the slide, so sorry about that, and that's pension relief. So there was $2.3 billion in payments for school districts and community colleges that spread over 2 years so that your employer contribution rates for PERS and STIRS are lower in both the budget year and then budget year plus one, as we call it, or the 21-22 fiscal year. So that was in the May revision that remains in place here in this final budget. The other piece was in the May revision, there was $4.4 billion in federal funding for what was called the Learning Loss Mitigation Grant. And this is additional funding that districts were supposed to use within the first 6 months of this year, so before the end of the calendar year, for a variety of activities that would be broadly intended to help provide additional support for students to make up for the fact that many of them maybe didn't learn as much as we otherwise would have expected from them during when schools closed. That number, the 4.4 billion, has now increased to 5.3 billion in this final budget, and the distribution of that funding has changed. So the May revision proposal was 4.4 billion, and it was split up into two pots. One was 1.5 billion that would be distributed based on the number of students with IEPs in each district, and that remains the same. That funding will still go out in the same way. But where we have seen differences is in some of the other components. So then the next part that was in the May revision was $2.9 billion that was going to be distributed based on, it was going to be distributed to school districts that had, essentially that had EL or low income students above 55% above. Whether if you got concentration grant funding, you would get this funding. If you didn't get concentration funding, you'd get nothing. So it was this sort of big binary, either you get nothing or you get a certain amount per student that would be uniform for all districts. That has changed now, and now the allocation there is the 2.9 billion will be distributed based on an LEA's share of the total supplemental and concentration funding across the state. So if you get 1% of all supplemental and concentration funding across the state, you'll get 1% of this $2.9 billion. So that's still going to benefit, if you're a district that has a lot of low-income or English learner students, you're still going to get a lot from that, but this is going to spread that funding out to a much larger number of districts. In the previous proposal, if you were 54.99% or lower, you would get nothing. Now you're going to get something, though it won't be as much as some of the others. Then in the final budget, there was another $980 million added for this purpose. And that pot of funding, that's what gets you up from the 4.4 billion to the 5.3 billion. That's going to be distributed based on district's overall LCFF allocation. So whatever share of LCFF that you receive, that funding will be distributed in the same way. And so that is an overall increase. The funding, as I mentioned on the slide, so the May revision was 4.4 billion. Now it's 4.8 billion in federal funding. Most of that is from the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which is a funding source that needs to be spent by December 30th of 2020. So it is going to mean that you'll have some pressure to figure out how to spend that money in the beginning of the year. And the 540 million is public aid general fund. I want to touch on special education. That's the next another big element. This is the one augmentation from January that stayed in place, or the one major augmentation that stayed in place, but it did get modified somewhat. So it was previously 645 million to increase special education funding rates, to increase the base rate essentially for the lower funded SOPAs. And it was going to get everybody up to, I think it was $640 per student. The final budget, this is largely what the Senate action was, which was to reduce the amount to increase base rates by 100 million. So instead of 645, it's 545. And then there's $100 million. The $100 million that's been sort of pulled out of that is being used to increase funding for, it's for the low incidence fund, which provides funding based on the number of students in each SOPA that are either have visual, hearing, or orthopedic impairments. Then the next issues I want to talk about are, these are kind of all getting into the things that are a little bit newer and maybe we're not specifically in the May revision. One was this issue of ADA calculations. The May revision didn't really do anything around ADA. It just sort of kept current law. And as you all know, when the legislature, when sort of the state kind of went into shelter in place and schools were closed, there was a hold harmless provision so that in 1920 we were using districts ADA as of February 29th, 2020. That was done specifically for the 1920 year, so that did not apply for 2021. So one big question was then what do we do in 2021? So what this budget includes is language that says that for calculating attendance, we will use in the 2021 year, we're going to use 2019-20 numbers, which is again based on us stopping February 29th of 2020. So whatever ADA was used for 1920, same ADA you'll be using for 2021. The sort of the change, I think that's a little bit more nuanced. That's different from what happened when we went into shelter in place is issues regarding instructional minute and day requirements. So again, when we shut down, there was a broad blanket exemption so that districts would not be penalized if they did not have an 180-day school year. Now, the expectation is still that the LEAs meet the instructional minute and day requirements, but they can do that through distance learning if they comply with certain requirements. And there's kind of a long list of what those requirements are in the trailer bill, but largely there's an attempt to make sure that there's some kind of interaction, synchronous interaction with the student throughout the day. And for those that are not, that there's some attempt to calculate sort of a time basis for the assignments that students are doing so that can be sort of converted to instructional minutes. This is one of the sort of fairly new things. There's a lot of detail there that I think I'm happy to answer some questions. I'm not sure I fully understand all those details quite yet, But I think that's the general idea, is that if a school district is going to close down, that's fine. You can still generate. You're not going to be financially penalized for that, but you do need to do certain things to make sure that you're complying with those instructional minute and day requirements in terms of how you structure your distance learning program. The other major thing that's in the budget, one is prohibition of layoffs for teachers, and so I'll break this up. It's for teachers and for classified employees, but there are two different provisions. Some of you might know that that statute actually has a provision that allows layoffs in the summertime if your LCFF funding does not grow by more than 2%. So under this budget, because it's a flat budget, LCFF does not grow by 2%, and that statute would take effect. That would have allowed school districts to issue layoffs of certificated staff in August. Because that, so the budget actually includes language that sort of makes that allowance for layoffs in the summertime not allowable this year. So you do not have the ability to go back and lay off staff right now in the summertime. Another provision that was added was related to classified employees, and what that provision states is that the districts for the fiscal year, for the 2021 fiscal year, you are not able to lay off classified employees that work in nutrition, transportation, or custodial services. You can still terminate somebody for good cause, but you cannot lay somebody off for other reasons. So that's something that I think is unique, that I don't recall this ever being included in a budget before. The prohibition of layoffs for teachers, that provision has been, I think, almost every year where it could have applied, it has been not withstood in the budget, but this is the classified employee proposal, something that I hadn't seen before. Then the last thing on our bullet here, and then there's one thing that I forgot to add that I want to make sure to talk about after that, is that there's now what are called, so I think you may know that through executive order, districts were now required to adopt an LCAP by July 1st this year. Instead, there was this expectation that by December 15th, you adopt the LCAP, and then in the meantime, you had to provide some requirements. There were some requirements of what kind of reporting you were to have. Well, in the trailer bill, they've added some specific requirements for learning. It's called the Learning Continuity and Attendance Plans, which also becomes an acronym that's LCAP. But there are some specific requirements here in the statute, and a lot of it is really related to the very specific issues that we're going through right now in terms of like, what are you doing for distance learning and how you're sort of adapting to that situation. These plans need to be completed by or adopted at the local board by September 30th of 2020, and the superintendent is required to develop a template for this by August 1st of 2020. Okay, so the last thing that I'll talk through in terms of proposals is something that was in the May revision. That's an important thing that I just forgot to put in here again, and that's this is an out-year issue, and that's the May revision included a proposal for a supplemental payment plan to provide funding beyond what was in Prop 98, and it was I think about $12 billion in supplemental payments, and they would be done by providing 1.5% of general fund revenues beginning in 21-22. Into the future, and then there's a provision there that sort of says that moving forward, the percentage of this is getting into very Prop 98 technicality, so I apologize for those of you who are not as familiar, but one of the formulas of Prop 98 says that, which is what we call Test 1, that schools and community colleges receive about 38% of general fund revenues annually. This would permanently increase the amount to be 40%. So a 2 percentage point increase, which I think is something like $3 billion annually. So of that $12.5 billion in supplemental payments, some of those are going to be one-time payments, but some of them will build up the Prop 98 spending level on an ongoing basis. That proposal is largely unchanged from what was in the May revision. It's still there. It doesn't have an immediate effect now, but it does have a fiscal effect in providing additional funding for schools in the future. So I know that was a lot to walk through. I'm sure you'll have lots of questions, so I'm happy to do that. I think one thing I'll just highlight for you all, I'm sure you all are thinking, one of the things that we are looking at, as we look at this budget, the budget largely avoids reductions, and if you take into account the fact that there's pension relief and that there's this additional federal funding provided, there is, I think, overall probably a year-to-year increase in overall school funding. But we recognize obviously there's a lot of cost pressures that you're facing right now with that. I think one thing that I think we are will be looking at and will be cognizant of as we're going into the next year is what happens next year. Because the way that deferrals for, and I did see that, I haven't listened to it yet, but I saw there's a deferrals podcast on the CASBO website that I haven't listened to yet. But the way deferrals end to be at the state level, it's sort of we do them to avoid cuts. We need to make reductions, so we defer payments, but it means that next year we have to make that payment again. And so if Prop 98 doesn't grow, for example, if you make 1 billion deferrals and Prop 98 doesn't grow $1 billion, then you have to make a cut or do something else to get your budget in balance. And so if we're going to be with deferrals of such a large magnitude, next year we're potentially looking at, even if Prop 98 funding is growing significantly, you might not necessarily be seeing augmentations. In addition to that, that 5.3 billion in federal funding, which is a lot of funding, which I'm sure is you all appreciate having it. It is one time, and so next year that funding is gone as well. And so that's, I think, an important thing that I know I'm sure you all will be looking at as well, in sort of going into next year. Okay, so I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
And so I'll moderate the questions that have come in. We have 54 questions so far, so I'm trying to mentally group them, but I'll begin with the hold harmless language. If you could walk us through the hold harmless and also help folks who are in the situation where they're increasing, not decreasing. And so there is language that if folks go to my news break on page 5 of the PDF version that's on your box, on your chat box, or your question Q&A box, there is language discussing that the state will continue to do hold harmless using 2019-20 ADA, but there is a section in terms of certifying through an audit process if numbers are increasing. Can you explain a little bit more about the hold harmless situation?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the, I think I'm still trying to learn the detail as well. I think there is some opportunity for, so the starting point is for everybody that you're using that 1920 fiscal year as the baseline. I think the expectation is that you still, even though we're using 2019-20 as the baseline, that there's an expectation that there still is an attempt to keep track of attendance in the budget year as well, because the expectation that next year or in 21-22 we would go back to sort of the way that we've been doing things before. I think that I am not as familiar. I'm not actually familiar with the specific provision that allows for them using growth. I wasn't sure. I actually wasn't totally sure that where that was, Sarah. But
and it's on section, I try to be as thorough as possible. It's in section 34, starting page 136 of the AB 77 trailer bill. There's also SB 98, which is the Senate version of the same education trailer bill. And it makes a reference that states that any positive adjustment to ADA in the 2019-20 fiscal year in the second or annual period attendance report submitted to the SPI after August 17, 2020 shall be substantiated by concurrence from an independent auditor. So I figured that language could be cover for those LEAs that do find themselves in a growth situation versus a declining enrollment situation. So I'm hopeful that that's the indication there.
Yeah, so when I read that, and again, this will be, when I read that, it was more like we're going to be extremely we are going to be very, very careful in reviewing any updates after the year ended, because we know that that year 1920 numbers are the ones that matter for 2021. So they were trying to add additional sort of oversight over any modifications. I didn't read that as necessarily that there's some way for you to demonstrate that your 2021 student count has grown.
And then the next. Yeah. The next is on federal funds. If you could help us break down, okay, where are all these federal funds coming? What are the various deadlines on how to spend them, and we should expect guidance. And I'm presuming the Department of Education will have to or the state board would have to promulgate regulations on the use of these federal funds. And so let's start with the federal funds portion first.
Right. So yeah. So and I will say this, so there are some things here that we didn't describe that are going out on a formula basis. Like there's I think it's 1.485 billion in what's, I think we're calling, there's a lot of acronyms in the federal stuff, ESSER funding. That one is going out based on, that's elementary, secondary schools, education, emergency relief funding. That's going out based on Title I formula. I didn't include that in the slides here. That's going to go out, and I think you have until the end of 21-22 to spend those funds. So that there's a little bit more time. Of the 5.3 billion that I mentioned here, again, there's 4.8 billion that's federal. 355 of that is from what's called the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. I think people are calling it GEAR when they're using the acronym. That's a pot of funding that states have discretion over how to use that funding. It could be used for higher education or K-12 education. There was some flexibility there, but it needs to be somewhere in education. That one, again, also a similar longer timeline. But the biggest chunk of money here is the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which is funding that's intended to be specifically for dealing with the public health emergency. It has more strict requirements. So I think the expectation is that this is something that's a little bit more directly related to what's going on with the pandemic, and the way that this is, again, funding that some of it is going to, for example, human services programs in the budget for homelessness. There was an increase in the amount of funding that was being provided in this final budget, but like half of it is going to K-12. And I think that there's a little bit more expectation that funding gets spent right away. And it's supposed to be spent for activities that are sort of providing additional support beyond the typical kind of school activity. I think I agree with you. I don't know how quickly, to be quite honest, I don't know how quickly the department will be able to get out guidance if you need to spend this money by December 30th. I do think your questions are valid. I think that's something that there needs to be some important clarification about how the funds can be used, because you're not going to have a lot of time to spend the money. I mean, if everybody knew, and you could, summer school, for example, would be a great thing to do, but obviously it's a little harder to all of a sudden start a summer school program if you weren't planning to, especially when you don't know if your school sites are ready to open. So I think that's something where I think it'd be important to get more information to you all about how to use the funding. The language in the budget itself is pretty broad and does have like a lot of different activities that you could be using. And so I think that's where I would start, is just skewing to what's in the trailer bill itself. It lays out a variety of different kinds of support, like extended day, additional tutoring, summer school, those kinds of activities to provide additional support. I think the funding also can be used, I know more broadly, the coronavirus relief funding can be used to reimburse states for costs for things that they incurred during the public health emergency. And so one question, I think, to clarify, I think for understanding, is whether you could do that yourself as well.
A question did come regarding pension, and so I wanted to give folks, if you go back to our May Revise article that we posted on May 14th, the $2.3 billion that was redirected to lower the CalSTRS, CalPERS employer rate contributions for CalSTRS in 2020-21. The rate will now be 16.15%, and that's from 18.4%. And so in 2021-22 for CalSTRS, it will go continue to go down a little bit. So 2020-21, 16.15, and then in 21-22, 0.02%. For CalPERS in 2020-21, that's reduced to 20.7% from 22.67%. And then for 21-22, that's 22.84%. So both CalPERS and CalSTRS, the employer rate is going to be reduced over the 2 fiscal years in 20 and 21 and 21-22. And that information is referred back in our May revise alert, and we'll also include it in this information for folks that have asked that specific question. Do you have anything else to add on the pension, Edgar?
I would just add, I think you mentioned it briefly with Sarah, but this was funding that, this is not extra money, this is funding that last year was intended to go towards reducing the long-term unfunded liability for the pension systems so that it would reduce your employer contributions in the long run. That has been now used to provide more immediate relief. So it's not going to provide that long-term savings, but it's going to provide a lot more in the short run.
So moving back to ADA, a question came up in terms of explaining the difference between what happened in the executive order and then what's taking place in the Budget Act. What's the difference in terms of how can we attain the ADA protection? Hold harmless. So
in terms of the ADA specifically, I think it's the same. So essentially what we're saying is the ADA modifications that we made to the 1920 year as part of SB 117, which was the bill the legislature passed in response to the executive order. We are going to use that same number that we're using in that for 1920. We're going to use that same number for 2021. I think that's the same. I think that actually the change now is not on what ADA is going to be. It's more what are, if any, penalties that exist for not meeting instructional day or instructional minute requirements. Under the executive order and under SB 117, we just said we're not even gonna pay attention to what your instructional year looked like in 1920. We recognize that you needed to close, and we're not gonna, in other years we would have said we're gonna prorate your LCFF funding because you didn't have a 180-day school year. So going into 2021, you're not going to have that sort of blanket freedom to say offer whatever amount of instructional time you want. You do need to meet the instructional minute requirements and the instructional day requirements, but there is additional language that allows you to meet that through distance learning. And that's where there's a lot of detail on sort of trying to, I think there was a lot of concern about sort of, in some cases, what does distance learning mean and what does it look like? And so I think that the trade labor language is intended to provide a little bit more detail so that you can kind of have some minimum expectations of what it means to have distance learning for students. And if you meet those minimum requirements, then we would consider that to have been offering an instructional day or offering a certain number of instructional minutes.
And then touching on distance learning, we've gotten a handful of questions of trying to understand what are the conditions that are laid out in the trailer bills regarding distance learning. There's an impression that it now seems very limited in terms of what specific situations have to be met in order to be able to provide these services. But what about situations where they already had robust distance learning programs set up and were able to effectively pivot? What happens in environments where we know that COVID-19 cases continue to rise, and so there's been hesitation from parents wanting to continue to use distance learning as an option? How do the requirements now under both AB 77 and SB 98 affect that?
So in terms of so I'll walk through some of the main requirements, but it might be that the question is a little bit less about that and more about when do I get to use distance learning and when not, maybe. But I'll walk through those real quick and then we can get to that. So I think the expectation is that you're going to be providing these, if you're getting guidance from state or local public health order to close, then you can close and you can offer distance learning as a way to provide instruction to students. Or the other alternative, which is that if you have students who are, I think what it lists is medically fragile, if you're at risk for some reason from in-person instruction, or if you were exposed to COVID-19 and you need to quarantine, then you would also be able to provide distance learning. I don't know exactly what that means for example, to the degree that some families choose not to choose not to be enrolled or choose not to want to send their child to a classroom. What does that mean? That, to be quite honest, I'm not totally sure what that means for the purposes of this. I think what I would, I think what I would highlight again is this difference between the instructional, between attendance and then meeting your instructional day and year requirements. As you know, your ADA is calculated based on actual attendance. You have a 180-day school year. If you offer the instructional minutes or instructional day, you are in compliance, whether or not students showed up the whole time, right? So I think that's where I think there's some of this distinction, and I think I'm still trying to figure out some of that. But I think you're going to be using your 1920 ADA no matter what. So for this year, you're going to get funded for that. Now then the question is, are you providing distance learning in the right way? And I think this kind of lays out some expectations for if students are not engaged, you have to make efforts to try to engage with them and to talk to them to make sure you understand what's going on and that you can provide materials and information. I don't think I know the answer to the question that you're raising about whether if a family just says, I'm not coming in, even if you've moved to 100% in the classroom, I'm not sure.
Okay, so we'll give that a pause and then we'll pivot to deferrals. Explain the deferral schedule. It's also listed on page 3 of the news break that we have attached to the Q&A box. If you don't mind walking through, because it's 3 fiscal years that have deferrals: the current year, the budget, and budget plus 1.
Yes, so the current year total deferral in the current year, I believe, is about 1.6 billion, and it's the June to July deferral. So it's really, I think that some of you might not get this payment until the beginning of July anyway, so I don't think it makes much of a difference for you all. It's more the way that we budgeted for it. But then where there is the bigger change obviously is in the budget year. So I think the deferrals, I think they start with sort of the June payment, then it goes to the May payment, the April payment, and they're all a little bit longer one over the other. So first there's a June to July deferral, then there's a May to August deferral, then there's an April to September deferral, and I think it just keeps going out. And then so I think that's kind of the way those deferrals are designed. I think the expectation is that for your purposes, if you're going to go out and borrow, that's the way it's in place, and we're going to know sometime in the fall whether or not there's federal funding that would undo those deferrals. But I think that the schedule itself, I think if we needed to go in and make some changes, I think there would be some clarity so that I know that in going out and borrowing, you need some specificity so that you can show sort of the lenders exactly when you're getting that payment. I think that the expectation, I think, is that some of the longer deferrals are the ones that would sort of get paid down first. I would say also the language, section 8.28 of the Budget Act, that specifies that it lists a whole bunch of things, which we were kind of calling the positive triggers, the triggers if there's additional federal funding. So one of them is obviously the school deferrals, and then there's a variety of other areas in other parts of the budget where if we receive additional federal funding, there will be cuts that will be undone or additional funding that will be provided. The expectation is that I think it's if we don't get the full amount that's required in there, that it will be prorated and distributed everywhere. So it's a possibility that maybe we don't have the whole 11 billion, but instead you're going to get deferred, say 8 or 7, depending on what that federal funding is. But that is the way that the deferrals are made. They're starting kind of with June to July, and they kind of work their way out towards the back. And I'm sorry, I don't have them specifically in front of me, but that's how they're done. I think the structure, I think, is not very different from what was the case in previous the previous recession. We still also have there's a process for getting a waiver for districts that can demonstrate that they would be unable to meet their obligations. They can go in and get a waiver for that. So that is still, I think it's about $100 million in each month that's available. I know that in the past, it's been typically some of the really small districts that were able to get those, but that is also something that would continue to be there and that is going to be available moving forward.
And districts and charter schools have to notify the county office by January 5th of 2021 if they anticipate having fully exhausted any internal or external sources of borrowing to do so. And so unlike what the legislature had proposed, this is immediate triggering of all the deferrals versus we will wait to see on October 1st if the deferrals take effect. In this budget agreement, the deferrals take effect immediately, correct?
Right, yeah. So the default is, the legislature initially had a sort of different default, which is we assume that there's the federal funding, and only once we find out that there's no federal funding, then we would implement either deferrals or the cuts. This final budget uses the administration's approach, which you start with assuming that there is no additional federal funding, and then we would only, if federal funding comes in, then we would make those changes.
And back to the federal funds, because we are hearing so many sources, one being the HEROES Act, which is something that the House in Congress passed of $3 trillion stimulus. We're also seeing an array of different federal funds that the state already has on hand. So the funding that's in this budget to provide for learning loss, those are federal funds that the state of California already has on hand. It's not something that we're waiting for Congress to pass, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So everything that's in the learning loss mitigation funding, it's actually funding all directly in the CARES Act itself through a variety of different pots, some of them that I described to you all, but that is funding that we know we are getting or we already got. So that there is no uncertainty about as long as the governor signs this thing, you're getting that money for learning loss mitigation. The other sort of contemplated federal funding, the HEROES Act is the one I know that people have been talking about because it was passed through the House. None of that is budgeted for specifically. That's what would if we got funding from the HEROES Act or any other sort of vehicle that is similar, then that's what would be used to reduce the amount of deferrals that you're facing. But there's no program that's being funded with federal funding that we have not confirmed that we have yet.
Good thing. Just a quick on the flexibility that Governor Newsom had proposed and may revise. All of those flexibility proposals did make it to this final budget agreement, and one of them was the CalSTRS on behalf exemption to when calculating the 3% towards your routine maintenance account, the RRMA. That continues to be in this trailer bill, and there's a reference. Haven't memorized all the pages yet, but I do make a specific reference in our news break. Going back to the LCAP, the new LCAP, because we love our acronyms, the Learning Continuity and Attendance Plan, just wanting confirmation that it's due September 30th, and this replaces the LCAP that had been extended to December 15.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's correct. Yes. So yeah, I was reading not the trailer bill, but the agenda of it, and it is very confusing because in there we talk about it as the LCAP, the 2021 LCAP, which is not the Local Control and Accountability Plan, but the Continuity and Attendance Plan. But yes, so the expectation is that then that would be what you would do as your plan to show what you're going to be doing and how you're going to be providing services for students. You don't have to worry about the previous requirement, which was to have a local control and accountability plan passed by December 15th.
And so we got a few questions of what page I was talking about on the ADA language. In the news break, it's page 5. In the trailer bill, it begins on section 34, starting on page 136. So as you continue making your way along, it says calculating the apportionment for 2020-21 fiscal year, and under that section is where you'll see the language regarding ADA hold harmless and how that information is being treated. So going back to the questions that have been asked, so more information in terms of the deferral exemption, if you could provide just a little bit more clarity of what LAAs can do in order to receive a deferral exemption from the state.
Yeah, so the deferral exemption, and I'm sorry, I'm need to find where it is in the trailer bill, but it's I think the language is, if not exactly the same, virtually identical to what was in there in the past, where there's a process, there will be a process for the Department of Education to review an application from you and make the determination that you are eligible to receive the waiver. I believe in the past, they've in previous situations, they gave pretty much everybody who applied a waiver. And I think I think the expectation is that you provide some documentation to show what your cash projections are during that period with the deferrals to show that you would be unable to meet your obligations. So it is fairly strict. It's not, you can't say like, I want an exemption because I don't want to have to go pay for a tram. It's more like this is an amount that would mean that I can't, or I don't want to dip into my reserves. This is more like we would not have the cash available to pay our bills, and we would end up with, maybe unable to meet our obligations. And I'm sorry, I don't have it quickly on hand here because I got sidetracked in where I am in the section, but I'll try to find it right now.
This is the part where, you try to tab, and I know in my sleep, I'm like, okay, it's page 127. That's where the non-classroom charter school language is at. And keeps me up at night. Two more questions regarding additional flexibilities on the interfund borrowing and then the proceeds for sales on surplus property. If you could just highlight those two flexibility measures. Yes,
and those I believe they are exactly the proposal that was in the May revision was allowed. So it was adopted. So I don't believe there were any modifications. So that does increase the percentage that the amount that you can borrow from special funds for cash flow purposes, and then it allows districts to sell surplus property. I think it's for 3 years. There's a 3-year. It's not like permanently, but for I believe 3 years you can sell surplus property and use the proceeds for deposit those proceeds into your general fund.
And the inter-fund borrowing allowance?
Yes, so that allows you to. So I think in that proposal, there's an ability to borrow up to. So it's for 2 years, and you can borrow up to 85% of one particular fund. If say you want to dip into a particular special fund, you can borrow up to 85% of that and use it for cash flow purposes to help. And the idea is that this is going to help you with dealing with deferrals and maybe some additional cost pressures that you might have. And I believe that flexibility is for the 2021 year and the 21-22 fiscal year.
So 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that we advocated for. Shifting back to the LCAP in terms of the original LCAP, how do we ensure that the programs and positions that are currently funded using the LCAP are reflected? And then was there any discussion, or do you think there'll be any discussion and guidance given in terms of tracking supplemental concentration funding expenditures as we wrapped up 1920 and now entering 2021? If we can't show how we've expended our SNC funds, what happens when we don't fully spend all of those dollars? And there had been in the legislative plan discussions to include requirements from AB 1835 by Assemblymember Weber, which would have stated that supplemental concentration grant dollars continue to be concentration dollars, and supplemental grant dollars moving forward can only be used for those specific purposes and cannot be spent outside of those requirements. And that did not make it into this final agreement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I would say I'm not sure the degree to which I think there's a recognition, obviously, that the LCAP for this year is not going to be this. You're not going to, even if you all tried to do one by July 1st, that there's a recognition that I think that the level of tracking is not going to be the same as it was in previous years. So I don't know that they've contemplated what is the way that you would demonstrate that. I think that ultimately becomes a local decision for how you try to clarify what that means. Because the AB 1835 requirement didn't take into place, you're not going to be subject to that more specific tracking of the supplemental and concentration funding. It is something obviously that locally you can do to help as you're talking with your stakeholders I think the continuity plan, the new LCAP that's only going to be for this 2021 year, it's really it's more, I would call it COVID-19 focused, right? The focus is on what are you going to do for distance learning? What are you going to do to mitigate learning loss? What are you going to do to sort of monitor the emotional well-being of students? How are you going to provide meals? Those are the focuses. There's some the particular areas. So it is different from what you would have seen in a typical LCAP. And I think it's a recognition that these are sort of the more immediate issues that we want, that there's more concern and information that the legislature wants to see. And some of that the other kind of tracking is not going to sort of be looked at in the same level.
Now moving on to the layoff of classified employees. Do you believe that it includes part-time employees in that categorization?
That's a good question.
And for our viewers, SB 98 Section 94 has an updated blurb on what the classified employee layoff intent language is from the legislature, as well as an additional paragraph on how they would want to, how they're prohibiting which specific employees under the classified status, transportation, child nutrition, and I'm forgetting the third one, custodial services would be exempted from. But they added then the last sentence they added in SB 98, which means that now AB 77 does not have the same language as SB 98. It does say that LEAs can still lay off employees for good cause. That is a change in SB 98. Mm-hmm. So the question is part-timers. Can we lay off part-time classified staff?
Yeah, so this is where I'm obviously looking at this with not a lot of background, but I would say the language specifically says, shall not implement layoffs or releases of any permanent or probationary classified employees who hold classifications in those three categories that Sarah mentioned. So if these are part-time employees, but this is like a permanent position that is always on a part-time basis, then I think that would prevent you from laying them off.
And for certificated, it's all certificated employees except for administrators.
Yes, certificated employees who are in administrative positions can be laid off, but not certificated employees who are in teaching or counseling positions and various other not administrative positions.
So a question came in terms of meals, because there is two components on child nutrition under the distance learning language, making sure that meals continue to be provided to low-income students. The question is, will meals be fully funded as they are through August 31st? I know the state is sitting on $714 million in federal child nutrition funds that the state is trying to seek a waiver. We have not yet gotten the waiver from the feds. And then there is $112 million from other federal fund sources for child nutrition purposes to boost up the reimbursement rate.
Yes, so that $700 million in child nutrition funding, we're still trying to figure out what the point of that was. That's a big open question. I think the one theory that we have is that they never actually gave it to us expecting that it was going to be for new stuff. It was the concern that with such flexibility in the programs in the CARES Act, or in not the CARES Act, but whatever, there was another legislation before that that created some flexibility, that there was concern that there was going to be so many meals served that the federal government didn't have enough money in its budget for it. And so the 700, that's just one theory we have, is that perhaps that was the original intent for it. So that, if that's the case, you can't use it for any new activities, and that would not be necessarily available. So I think this final budget includes that $112 million one-time funding that you mentioned, and that's intended to provide some additional reimbursements, in part because there's recognition that there are some the costs that you face from sort of the closure through the summer maybe are higher than you would have anticipated, and that you're not getting the same level of funding. So I think that's part of what that funding is intended to do. I don't have a good sense of whether how that's going to sort of affect your overall budget, whether that's going to be enough to help sort of mitigate those the loss of full funding, but that's sort of the intent there.
So back on the LCAP, we are required, though, to still do the parent overview by December 15th, the overview budget document, not the LCAP itself, the Local Control Accountability Plan. This would not be used to track supplemental and concentration for funding, correct?
Right. I think this is, I think this is my understanding, and I, again, just having quickly looked at it, I think it was more of a pretty high level of information for parents, so it's not getting to the level of tracking specific dollars like that.
So on the layoff, does this language, since it says from July 1 to July 1 of next year, mean that we can't serve the March 15 notices terminating contracts as of June 30th, 2021 for certificated staff?
That was not my read of it, but now some of your questions are making me go back and read it and see if I see anything that changes my mind of how I thought. But
and for viewers out there, I used to work with Edgar Cabral when I was in the legislature and the Assembly Budget Committee, and I would always say, Edgar, what do you think we meant by this? Please explain.
Yeah, I think that the way that the language is written here, I'm trying to go back to the provision. I think that the intent was more that you just was to just remove the August window from taking effect, and I think that's what the code section itself is. So there's a specific code section. So this is now okay. I think I'm feeling comfortable about this as I look as we go, and I think this is. Here, I'm going to look at the.
Yeah, it's page 150, Ed Code 44955.95.
Yes, so that Ed Code is not the code section that has the entire layoff requirements or layoff statute. This is a very specific code section that's about this, what we call the August layoff window. And so that specific provision is what says that if your LCFF funding doesn't grow by 2% in a year, that therefore this new layoff window takes effect and you're able to lay off staff. I think it's by August 15th. That the amendment here in that section 38 just says that from July 1st, 2020 to July 1st, 2021, this specific code section is not operative. So it means you cannot lay people off in August. It doesn't say that the March layoff process is not, that code section is still taking effect the way it normally does. So yeah, I think my interpretation is that then you are not able to lay off anybody entering the school year. It doesn't mean that we've tied your hands have not been tied for the 21-22 fiscal year. At this point, this is more specifically saying, and I think it's probably in line with many of the things that you're seeing in this budget, is sort of like run back your 1920 program, right? We're saying we're going to hold you harmless. We're going to provide you funding like we did last year. We're going to provide you the same LCFF funding rate as last year. And then we're going to essentially telling you that you have to keep personnel similar to what it was in 1920.
And then I would see the same as this, the layoff for classified employees does not prohibit LEAs from reducing hours to mitigate then the available resources to compensate. It doesn't tie, that section does not state anything or reduce the ability for LEAs to reduce hours to the minimum requirements.
Right, yeah.
Well, with that, I think we've done the best that we can to get to all the questions. What we always do is we'll review them and continue to seek advice and support in answering all of your questions. If you do have additional questions, we are always available and we're here for you. You have our contact information. My email is sbatches@casbo.org, and we thank you so much, Edgar, for being here today. We recognize how important and the hard work that everyone's doing to ensure that we can safely reopen schools this fall. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you, Edgar.
Yeah, thank you.